Tom's a graduate of Willamette, class in 1965. Majored in history and behavioral sciences before attending grad school at the U of O and also at Wayne State and the University of Chicago. Tom and his wife, Patricia, relocated to Salem in 2010. If you haven't met Patricia, she's sitting right here. You can greet her at intermission. And he had retired in 2010 as the chair of the Department of Leadership at the University of Memphis. Other academic positions Tom held were at Indiana University, Washington State, Illinois University, University of Detroit, and the University of Oxford, where he was a visiting scholar at Green Templeton College. His academic field is the study of executive leadership and professional preparation of executive leaders serving education and public sector organizations. He has published extensively, has led numerous nationwide survey research-based studies for educational organizations and public foundations. In retirement, he continued his collecting of Civil War photography. Buffalo Bill Cody's memorabilia and also antique firearms. Since retirement, he's published a book on Union Civil War generals and presently has a book in press titled The Photographic History of the Buffalo Bill Wild West. So let's welcome one of our newest members, Tom Glass.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Everyone's out bright and early. Now, if the technology works, we can get started. I'm not a professional historian, but history has been an avocation ever since I was at Willamette. I was a history major, or dual major, but the history side didn't seem to be something that I could get a job with. Same today. So anyway, to make a long story short, Buffalo Bill, William Frederick Cody. Who is Buffalo Bill? Is the Buffalo Bill that's in the media occasionally, is the real deal? Was he just a showman, or was he a real person with a real history? And he was popular, and I'll just give you an example. The Buffalo Bill Wild West, an outdoor and indoor arena show, was organized. The first performance was on May 19th, 1883 in Omaha, Nebraska. The last performance was in October of 1916. And the best estimate that I could find of how many people went to the Buffalo Bill Wild West to see was 50 million, with another 10 to 15 million in Europe. How many Americans have been seen in the flesh more often than Buffalo Bill? I don't think any, really. Also, for 10 years before 1883, he was on the stage. And during the theater season was going all over the East Coast with the Buffalo Bill combination, which was a shoot-'em-up melodrama. And there were thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who saw that over the years. So Buffalo Bill definitely is an American icon that we really don't talk about that much. But today, instead of giving you a lecture, you always expect professors to give lectures, don't you? I'm not going to lecture, I'm just going to tell stories. Mostly true stories, with a little bit of prevarication here and there. So, the first story I want to tell you is about me and Buffalo Bill. Okay, this is the 1903 season in London. And this is a promotional telling prospective folks coming to the show is, hey, Buffalo is a scout. I'm having a bit of technical difficulty here. See if I can get it back on my sweater. Okay. Can you hear now? But anyway, Cody was an icon. He was a scout, and he was lots of help. And here is where I was introduced to Bill Cody. Tom Glass at Buffalo Bill's grave in Colorado in 1951. And I also have to say, that's where I bought my first Buffalo Bill artifact. And it was, remember the Viewmasters? I bought a Buffalo Bill slide for my Viewmaster. Well, anyway, that's where Buffalo and Bill and I met. At his grave, and there's a small museum. It's on Lookout Mountain outside of Golden, Colorado. It's a good place to go visit if you're in the Colorado, Denver area. Well, a few years later, and 500 artifacts later, here I am at Buffalo Bill's grave. And museum. Museum is larger than it was in 1951, but that's how I met Buffalo Bill and became interested in Buffalo Bill. My mother told me that, I can't remember this, but she did, that I went, when we got off, we came back home after vacation, I actually got a book, a little children's book, by Sharon Garst about the life of Buffalo Bill. So that started my Buffalo Bill collecting, which kind of still going today. That's my favorite photograph of Buffalo Bill, taken about 1871 by Brady Studio. It's taken in New York. And that is a very early picture of him. It's a cabinet card, what we call a cabinet card. And there's nothing better than this cabinet card of Cody, in my opinion. Buffalo Bill was born in 1846 in LeClaire, Iowa. Those of you who watch Antique Pickers, that's the town he was born in. Antique Pickers, they originated in LeClaire, Iowa. His father was a Canadian who had migrated down from Toronto to the Cleveland area, where he married a Quaker lady. And this is their home in LeClaire. And that's his mother, Mary Laycock Cody, Buffalo Bill's mother, who was a school teacher before she stayed home to raise 4 daughters, 2 sons. And I'm going to kind of leave it here because we're going forward in our story to when he was 18 and joined the cavalry during the Civil War. Now, we don't know. We have a lot of recollections about his childhood, but we have very little hard data. In other words, it's very difficult to do archival research on this part of his life. But he had a tough childhood. His folks left LeClaire, Iowa. His father was very ambitious, an entrepreneur, a real entrepreneur, who decided to buy land in the Kansas Territory. And so they sold their farm in LeClaire, Iowa, and moved to a small town north of Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, which is right on the Mississippi River. Right, it's right next, I'm not Mississippi River, it's right next to the state of Missouri. And this is 1856, 57, and they couldn't have chosen a worse time to move to Kansas. Bleeding Kansas, border wars. And Mr. Cody didn't do his homework because he bought land right in the middle of a neighborhood of pro-slavery farmers. And he was an abolitionist. His wife was a Quaker. So, anyway, he didn't keep his mouth shut, and in a, I guess you call it a political forum, was stabbed and almost killed by a pro-slavery advocate. And during the next 2 years, he was ill a great deal of the time, and he also had to hide from his neighbors. And he also took part in the Lecompton Treaty, Constitution for the Free State of Kansas. And anyway, about 3 years later, he died, and when Buffalo Bill was 12 years old. So Buffalo Bill is 12 years old. His older brother is already dead from a horse, falling off a horse, and he has 4 sisters and his mother. And he went to work at age 12. Alexander Majors, one of the partners of Majors, Russell, and Waddell, had a huge freighting outfit located in Leavenworth. And what they did, these were called bull trains, not mule trains, but bull trains, oxen trains, that carried out supplies to the Colorado Territory. They would go through Julesburg, Colorado, and deliver to Denver. And in one case, in 1858, the mule train, or the bull train, was carrying supplies for the U.S. Army to to unload at Fort Laramie before the Army went on to subdue Brigham Young and the Church of Latter-day Saints in Salt Lake. But anyway, things didn't go quite well for the Army or the bull train, and they wound up having to spend the winter at Fort Bridger. And he met, at that time, Jim Bridger, a famous mountain man, and he also met Kit Carson. And that was the kind of life he lived on these bull trains, not as with a big, 10-foot whip or anything, but as a messenger and as a herder, because they had had horses. They had to herd along the way and so forth. But that's what he did when he was 12, 13. And by the time that he was about 16, 17, he was probably doing a few rides on the Pony Express. And the Pony Express was owned by Majors, Russell, and Waddell. So he became a full-time provider for his family at age 12. Then he moved into another phase of his life, which I call juvenile delinquent. He got involved with the Redlegs, Jennison's Redlegs. And this was kind of a guerrilla group who went across the Missouri border and stole horses of the pro-slavery people. And the border wars, so he was mixed up in the border wars until his mother died. He honored his promise to her not to join the Union Army. And she died in 1864, and he joined the Union Army. As a private, and he ended up, after the war, as a private. He was involved in several battles. We do have his military records, so we know that he was 6 foot tall. He had blue eyes, and we learned a little bit about him from his military records. So he was an honest-to-God soldier. He, in all likelihood, did ride some for the Pony Express, and he was on the bull trains at several which were attacked by Indians, and so he involved in Indian warfare at age 13, 14, and survived the Civil War. While stationed in St. Louis at the tail end of the Civil War, he met this lady who was 2 years older than him, and her name was Louisa. And she was a very attractive city girl. Yes. And somehow or another, she agreed to marry Cody. In fact, they got engaged, and he had to go out and drive stagecoach for 3 or 4 months to get enough money to get married. And they left St. Louis after the honeymoon and went up the river. And all at once, when she got to Kansas, she found out what frontier life was like, and she never liked it. And they would be married until he died in January of 1917. But it was not a very good marriage. They were very ill-suited. Now, I think, oh, one other slide. He had 4 sisters. And he supported all 4 sisters for his entire life. He was extremely supportive of his sisters, especially, and after his mother died, his older sister, Julia, basically became kind of like a mother figure for the young man. And so all the sisters had a very close relationship with their brother, and the only, and very often, his wife would not say kind things about his sisters. And his sisters never said kind things about Louisa. So, anyway. Now, that's kind of the story of his life up to 1866. And let's just drop off this story for a minute. I'm going to give you another story. This story is right here in Salem, Oregon. This is a Salem, Oregon story. And it's August 28th, 1902. And at 4:30 in the morning, the Buffalo Bill Wild West came down from Portland and unloaded just out here at the train tracks. And got 160 or 180 horses, a bunch of buffalo, and other animals off of the train, and set up a 16,000-person tent arena, portable arena, about quarter of a mile from here. And by 6:30, the 500 Buffalo Bill Wild West members, employees, were sitting down to breakfast. At 10 o'clock, there was a huge parade down through downtown and then back out to the arena. And believe it or not, Salem, Oregon, population between 5,000 and 6,000 people in 1902, there were 14,000 people at the show. They came from the central Willamette Valley to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And, of course, schools had to let out because there wouldn't be any kids in school. And think of all the people who didn't go, the few people who did not go see Cody, probably saw his parade and saw him riding. At that time, he had a white horse, riding down, I don't know, which street, maybe State Street. And then they played and then moved on down to Roseburg the next day. So it was, and the newspaper, the Statesman Journal, had a real fascinating article the next day. Everybody enjoyed the performance. It was a great performance. And they said everyone in Salem and their neighbors were there. And so this was the first time the Buffalo Bill Wild West came to the West Coast. So Buffalo Bill was here, 1902, 1910, 1914, 1915. Now, how many of you have been to the Pendleton Roundup? Well, not that many. How many of you went to the Pendleton Roundup a long time ago? Raise my hand. 1950s for me. Well, in probably the 50s and 60s, if you compared the program for the Buffalo Bill Wild West in 1910 and to compare it with the Pendleton Roundup program in 1910, which was the first year of the Roundup, they're very similar. Very similar. One, cowboys doing cowboy things. Two, Indians. Three, reenactment of historical events. That was what the Buffalo Bill Wild West was all about. So, now I've told you the story that yes, Buffalo Bill was here. Have I ever found a Buffalo Bill Wild West artifact in Salem? No. Would I like to? You betcha. Okay. This was only the real tragedy in his life. He had really two major tragedies in his life, and this is probably the one that hurt the most. When he was on the stage with the Buffalo Bill combination, his 6-year-old son died of scarlet fever, and he was just barely able to get home. They were living in Rochester, New York at the time, and they just barely got home before little Kit Carson, Cody, died. Now, move on to another story. Buffalo Bill, the scout, the Army scout for the Army, and engaging in combat with Native Americans, Indians, for the Army. He was really a scout. He really did participate in numerous encounters with the Sioux, Cheyenne, sometimes some Arapaho. And this is what he looked like at Fort Hays, Kansas in 1868. His first action there was with Captain George Arms and a company of the 10th Cavalry, which was the Buffalo Soldiers. And he was a participant in the first action in which the regiment took part. And at the same time, at Fort Hays, there was another guy there. This guy. Ever heard of Wild Bill Hickok? Okay. Hickok was also a scout with Cody in 1868, 69. But this was not the first time that Cody met Hickok. When he was running the bull trains, he met Hickok. He also met Hickok during the Pony Express days. In fact, he was a witness to a gunfight that Hickok was involved in. And somehow or another, Hickok, I know he looked up to Hickok as kind of a model, a role model. And their relationship persisted until 1874, when Hickok was part of his stage production and for a few months. And then Hickok, of course, got shot and killed in Deadwood soon after. One of the actions that he was involved in resulted in being awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He led a large company of cavalry, 3rd Cavalry, and engaged in a battle, and he led the charge against the Indians. Not Captain Meinhold, but Cody led the charge, and the outcome was he got a Congressional Medal of Honor. Another Indian battle that is in all the history books is the Battle of Summit Springs, in which Cody shot the Cheyenne chief called Tall Bull. Cody, in his autobiography in 1879, said he did not intend to shoot Tall Bull, but what he wanted was Tall Bull's horse. And so anyway, he shot Tall Bull, and that is something in the most books about Buffalo Bill. Of course, with Buffalo Bill, there's always controversy. Some people said he did it. Some people say he didn't do it. Probably he did. And I always read the after-action reports that are provided by the officer in charge of the action. In other words, in the Army, when you have a combat action, you have to write a voluminous report. And you can only find these reports buried deep in the National Archives. But that's what, if you really want to know what happened, that's the source that you go to. Oops, I'm sorry, let's go back. The other battle, major battle he was involved in, we'll talk about later on. But now I want to talk a little bit about Buffalo Bill. Why do we call him Buffalo Bill? Buffalo Bill, Buffalo Bill. Always get your kill. He shot buffalo, even though there were no buffalo in the United States. There are bison, but no buffalo. So it really should be called Bison Bill. But anyway, in 1868, another thing, you know, in those days, people out on the frontier, they changed jobs real often. You know, according to the season, winter, summer, what's going on. Well, anyway, Union Pacific Railroad was being built through Kansas out to Promontory Point, Utah, and they had one of their affiliates called the Kansas Pacific was building across central and eastern Kansas, western Kansas, and they had large number of track layers, most of them being Irishmen with Gandy shovels. Gandy made shovels. That's what we call, you know, shovels. Guys who have shovels, shoveling the railroad bed and so on. Gandy dancers. But Cody got the job from the Kansas Pacific of providing buffalo meat, fresh buffalo meat, to the track layers. His contract was to provide like 20 buffalo a day. And he shot buffalo for about 8 months. And when he got done, we do know that he provided 4,200 some odd buffalo to the Kansas Pacific Railroad. And remember in those days, you know, they had no refrigerator cars. You know, they had no ice, they had no refrigerator cars. So it had to be freshly killed. And so that's how he got his nickname, Buffalo Bill. He wasn't really what later became a market hunter, a buffalo market hunter. He only shot buffalo for a purpose, and that in this case was to feed track layers. He was never one of the buffalo hunters like Bat Masterson, who went out and shot 60, 80 buffalo at a time and left the carcasses rotting out on the prairie. That's just not what Cody did. In fact, he later became one of the nation's leading advocates of preserving the buffalo and actually purchased a buffalo herd. But anyway, he was truly a buffalo. There was a major contest between him and a scout named Billy Comstock. And between Fort Hays and Fort Harker, all the officers from Fort Hays got in their wagons and met a bunch of officers from Fort Harker on a Sunday. And it was right in the middle of a large northern herd, and had a buffalo shooting contest between Comstock and Cody. And Cody won. And but it really never got into papers that much, and a lot of authors have said, well, that was just probably Cody's PR guy talking. But it wasn't, because a few years ago, the county was putting in a new road, and they were out, you know, grading and so forth, and unearthed huge numbers of champagne bottles, all in one area. And that's what the officers always did. They took baskets of champagne out. And so maybe there really was this contest between Billy Comstock and Cody. I think there probably was. Knowing Cody, Cody was always buying horses that he raced. And he always made a lot of money in those days racing his horses. And I'm talking about, he was riding his horses, not somebody else. And that picture also back there is also him with his buffalo rifle. His buffalo rifle was a converted Civil War musket that was converted to fire cartridges. And if you go to the Cody Museum in Cody, Wyoming, you can see what's left of it. But really, it's just one of his buffalo rifles. And here, throughout from 1870 until the 1880 something, in the summers he would go out hunting on the plains, oftentimes taking very important people on hunts. And this is it. You can see Lucretia Borgia. That's what he called his buffalo rifle. And there it is, crossways. And the guy sitting there with his hand up there is the Earl of Dunraven, a very rich Englishman. And the two guys standing back there is Lieutenant Schuyler Crosby, and I don't know the other officer. But this is after a buffalo hunt. He took the Earl of Dunraven on, and of course, the Earl had to pay him. Here's just a sort of I don't know, I can't explain where this happened or why it happened, but it's kind of a clever photograph of Cody. Both of these come from tintypes, and this is sort of, after a hunt, a little publicity photo probably. Now, speaking of hunts, there were two hunts, buffalo hunts, that made Cody a national figure. And they were both sponsored by Phil Sheridan. Phil Sheridan was his sponsor, his friend, and employer. And the first hunt was with 10 rich guys from New York and Chicago who went out to Fort Hays and hooked up with Buffalo Bill and Phil Sheridan and went south for about 50 miles and hunted buffalo. And this was like in November, December, cold. And one of the hunters was Winston Churchill's grandfather. Yeah, Leonard Jerome was one of the hunters. And there were several other famous folks, including the owner-publisher of the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennet. And Sheridan set that up, hired Cody, and then when they came back from the hunt, Cody got a free trip to New York, and that's when he saw the bright lights of Broadway, and he also saw himself being played on the stage by an actor in a Wild West shoot-'em-up melodrama. And that's when he first got the idea, hey, there might be some money to be made on the stage. Probably be a lot easier than shooting buffalo. And James Gordon Bennet sponsored that, and Bennet became kind of a good friend of Cody's. The second hunt was a political hunt set up by General Sheridan to please his boss, General Sherman, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Army, to appease the Russian ambassador. The Grand Duke Alexis had been a naughty boy in Moscow and had gotten involved with the wrong lady. And his father, the Tsar, sent him to the U.S. to let things cool. Well, anyway, here again, out there in the plains, this time we have a hunt. We have Sheridan, we have the Grand Duke Alexis, and the third party in this hunt was a guy named George Custer. Right, Lieutenant Colonel of the 7th Cavalry. This was one big time hunt. 40 wagons moved out of Fort Hays with food, champagne, oysters, everything you can imagine, these huge tents and everything. It took a whole battalion of troops, cavalry, to set everything up and kind of organize the hunt. Spotted Tail and about 50 or 60 Sioux warriors were also invited to give a dance and so forth, so the Grand Duke Alexis could see wild Indians. And the hunt came off very, very well. It made the newspapers all over the country. And Cody is now very well known. Next story is that we'll move from Indians hunting, and the story will be about becoming a kind of a media star. And one of the guys who really propelled this is Ned Buntline, Colonel E.V. Judson, a scoundrel if there ever was one, and a bigamist, twice over. Yes, I mean, he was also arrested twice and almost hanged for inciting riots. But he was a writer of dime novels. And he found Cody and looked, actually the story goes that he found Wild Bill, Hickok, and Hickok told him to move on. And so he said, I know a young man maybe you want to talk with. And so he went over and Cody. And Cody just happened to, want to talk to him. And the outcome was Judson went back and wrote a dime novel, Buffalo Bill, Borderman, and it sold a lot. And that was the first of about 82 dime novels. Every kid is buying a nickel dime novel about Buffalo Bill, all of Buffalo Bill's adventures. But probably the most unique thing Buntline did was to convince Cody to leave Fort McPherson, where he was then stationed as chief scout for the 5th Cavalry, and to leave the 5th Cavalry and go to Chicago and be on the stage. And this is the three guys who were on the stage in '72, Texas Jack Omohundro, Cody's friend who came up from Texas, Cody and Judson. And they produced a melodrama in Chicago. It was, it was a critical disaster, but a popular success. And that was how the whole thing started. Buffalo Bill is now on the stage. The dime novels are rolling out. He's on the stage, shooting blanks at Indians. You ought to read these dime novels. They're great. And so this is his buddies. And after the first season, Omohundro and Cody said to Judson, leave us. You're cheating us. And so the next year, they got their friend, Hickok. Well, Bill Hickok just could not adjust to city living. He basically was a gambler, a gunman, and a brawler. And that's what he did. And here, Scouts of the Plains, this is what in those days was a theater program. And there's Omohundro. And here is what Cody looked like in the mid-1870s as a showman in Chicago. Doesn't look like buckskins, does it? He's a showman. And here is a painting of him at the action in which he got the Congressional Medal of Honor. And the reason, and the painting was used during those years with a combination to kind of publicize that he was the real thing. He was a real scout. He was a real plainsman. And one of the battles on the stage. In those days, we had what on the stage was combinations, and what a combination was a group of actors who went from town to town, theater to theater. And they had 2 plays. That's why they were called a combination. They would perform one play, perform the second play, and leave. So it wasn't like the old model where a theater had its own group of actors, its repertoire company. So anyway, 1876, you have all heard of the massacre of George Custer, or the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Anyway, what happened after that was that Cody was called by Sheridan off the stage, come out and become the chief scout again of the 5th Cavalry. We're moving the 5th Cavalry from Fort Russell, which is Cheyenne, up to Fort Robinson, which is up on the border, and we're going to reinforce General Crook, General Terry at the Bighorn as they pursue Sitting Bull. Well, Cody got involved in a hand-to-hand fight with a sub-chief, Cheyenne sub-chief, as 1,000 Cheyenne warriors were moving to reinforce Sitting Bull. And in hand-to-hand combat, he shot Yellow Hair. And I know this is going to sound really gross, but anyway, he shot Yellow Hair. His horse stepped into Gopher Hole, he fell down. His Winchester flew out in front of him. He scrambled up, got to Winchester, shot Yellow Hair off the horse, and then scalped him and held up the scalp as the 5th Cavalry charged by, saying, "The first scalp for Custer." Pretty kind of, today it doesn't sound too good. General Merritt was there and witnessed the battle between Yellow Hair and Cody. So we know it happened. We know how it happened. And I own 2 letters, by the way, in which he describes to an artist what he wore, what happened, what Yellow Hair wore. He completely describes. There's the costume he wore. And this is the play where they reenacted. And Captain Jack Crawford was a stage partner of his, and Crawford often came through Salem reading his horrible poetry. And I guess what interested me is that poor Crawford, Cody shot him in the groin on the stage with a blank. And anyway, they separated. And then later Crawford is in Salem, downtown, reading his poetry and gets on the train and is seriously injured in the train wreck at Lake Labiche. And there's Cody on his stage days. Now, the show. Saving the best to last. In 1882, Cody came up with the idea after watching cowboys working on his ranch north of North Platte, Nebraska, saying, you know, this is kind of interesting. And so he was home in North Platte, and he said, what's going to happen this 4th of July? What's the city planning for 4th of July? And everybody in the saloons looked at him and said, well, I don't know. So he said, I'll take care of that. So basically what he did is put together a show on the 4th of July. And it featured lots of cowboys, lots of riding, lots of roping, and so forth. It was called the Old Glory Blowout. And it went off very well. And so he then got the idea of coming up with a Wild West show that could be transported the next year. And on May the 19th, 1883 in Omaha, the show got underway. And that's the program for the first performance. It's signed on the inside by a private in the Army stationed at Omaha Barracks. He signed it and dated it, said first program. And I bought it, believe it or not, in London, England. There's his partner, Doc Carver. Doc Carver was he was a trip. He was a fantastic marksman. I mean, he was. And he was a dentist. His father taught him dentistry, and that's why they call him Doc. He also had a foul, foul temper, and he drank a lot. And there's the father of American public relations. If you have ever taken a course in public relations, first chapter in the book, they might say, this is the guy that started it. And this was Cody's friend from the very first performance until he died. John Burke. He was Arizona John Burke, Major John Burke, but really he was from Baltimore. And he was a master promoter. And his florid style of writing, oh, it's horrible. Now, after a couple of years touring the country, and probably the most notable thing that happened in the first 2 years was they were going down to New Orleans to spend the winter at a great big exhibition down there, and the boat that their equipment and everything on sank in the middle of the Mississippi River. And another thing that happened is that Cody challenged his cowboys who wouldn't ride buffalo. He said, "Come on, guys, get up on these buffalo. You know, people want to see it." And the cowboys said no. And so Cody said, "You babies." He got on the buffalo in Cincinnati, and well, anyway, he spent 2 weeks in a hospital in Cincinnati. 1887, the Wild West was invited to go to London. American exhibition there invited them to set up on the American exhibition grounds. And Cody got himself appointed by the governor of Nebraska as a militia colonel. So now he became Colonel Cody. And they were going to play at Earl's Court, which is in Kensington, London. And this is the troop on the SS Nebraska, leaving New York, and all of the Indians, they all fought to cross the great. They would never get across the Great Water alive. They fully expected to die. Well, about 3 days out of New York, they almost did. Somehow the steering gear in the ship failed, and they were like this, for like 3 days or a couple of days until they could fix it. And the weather was terrible. Everybody was horribly seasick, with the exception of Annie Oakley. But you can see Buffalo Bill there. And that's what he looked like in 1887 in London. This guy was a matinee idol. And there's the number 1 attraction. This is Buck Taylor, who was in charge of the Cowboys. He was a 6'4" tall, handsome guy from Texas. And he worked on the Cody Ranch in North Platte, Nebraska. And he was a great rider and cowboy. And he was handsome. And I'm telling you, in 1887, every lady in London, well, they swooned. So, and he was really very popular. And he was actually really the first king of the Cowboys. And so that's how Hollywood probably, some PR guy knew about this and said, okay, Roy Rogers, you can be king of the Cowboys. One of the main attractions in the Wild West show was the Deadwood coach. This is a stagecoach that really did run the mail around Deadwood, and it would run around the arena. And the Indians would chase it, and Buffalo Bill and the Cowboys would come in and rescue the folks in the stagecoach. And in London, one day, there were 4 kings riding in the stagecoach, along with the Prince of Wales, Edward. Yeah, and they were rescued. 1885, I'm backing up a little bit. 1885, the show did have Sitting Bull with it for about 3 months. And this was, and during those months, Cody established a fairly close relationship with Sitting Bull. And they got along very well. And Sitting Bull really did like Annie Oakley a lot. Red Shirt, who was the Indian contingent during most of the years of the Wild West were like 60 to 100 people. This would be boys, girls, mothers, and fathers. Total families. And they lived in an Indian village on the Wild West grounds. And part of your ticket that you bought, so if you paid 50 cents to get in general admission to the Buffalo Bill Wild West, you got to visit the Indian village before the show started. You could buy souvenirs made by the Indian ladies. And there had to be somebody in charge of the Indian contingent, and one of them was Red Shirt, who was a Sioux chief, or Jack Red Cloud, son of famous Red Cloud. This was a reenactment. They did reenactments in the arena. This one here is the settler's cabin. There's Ma Whitaker and John Y. Nelson, the old trapper hunter. That's probably a deer pelt across the saddle. And the settler's cabin is attacked by the Indians, and Buffalo Bill rides in and saves them. 1883, the Columbian Exhibition. Most of you know about that. It was a small show in Chicago. About 12.5 million people attended it. 4 million of them attended the Buffalo Bill Wild West, which was next door to the exposition grounds in Chicago. And I'm running out of time. Some photographs. How about that? 1880s cameras. They had shutter speed that would accommodate watching Cody ride. He was a natural horseman. These are in the arena in 1902. The reason I selected to show these to you is that this is what happened here in Salem in 1902. There's Iron Tail, one of the chief. All of you have seen you've seen this man your whole life. Just take a nickel out of your pocket and look at that's Iron Tail. There's Cody. You can see he's getting a little gray-headed. He also had to wear a wig. There we go. Cody. And as the years went by after 1898, they had Mexican vaqueros, Rough Riders of the world, and they also had army units that became popular after the Spanish-American War, and this was one of them. And now the end. The end. Unfortunately, Cody was such an entrepreneur, he spent money faster than he made it. And he had investments that went sour, and so he kept, every year, he wanted to retire, but he couldn't retire because, he had a cash flow problem. And so he had to partner up with Pawnee Bill, who had actually worked in 1885 the show. And this is the man who I don't know. This is Johnny Baker, Cody's foster son, and this guy is Harry Tamman, who owned the Denver Post newspaper, and through a crooked contract with Cody, was able to seize his show after the season in 1913, and that was the end of the Wild West. But Cody had to tour for 2 years with Sells Photo Circus and Buffalo Bill. He had to work for Harry Tamman. And one of those years, guess what? 1915, Sells Photo and Buffalo Bill came to Baker City and also to Salem. But I don't have a program from Salem. And there, Bill and Louisa kind of reconciled in 1915 in Roseburg, Oregon. Buffalo Bill bids you farewell. Do you have any questions? Okay. Do you have any questions? Yes, one question. Okay, I got to go to the mic now. Yeah, it's gonna. What is your question?
Okay, this is Irene. I have two questions kind of connected. It seemed like I could never figure out when he left the Army, and I could never figure out if he ever went home, and I wondered if that was why he only had one son.
That we know of. Okay, the question is, when did he leave the Army? The answer to that is very simple. We have his discharge. We have his, in other words, his records. And he left very, very early in 1866. And also know that he paid the Army $6.25 for a Spencer carbine that he took with him. And that's when he went home. His mother was dead or was dying. And the sisters are trying to run a hotel, which subsequently failed when Cody and his bride took it over, and Cody had all his friends stay for free. And is that right? Okay. What's another question? If you don't have any questions, I do. Okay. Right behind you.
Do you know if they were connected with Chautauqua at all at that time during some of his career? Or?
No. Closest he came to Chautauqua was during the years that he was in the Buffalo Bill combination on the road. He and his family lived in Rochester. I think that's the closest he came. No.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, okay, I got a question. How many of you saw Buffalo Bill on television, you know, when you were kids? Or the movie with, who was the actor that played Buffalo Bill in Calamity Jane? That movie with Buffalo Bill, you know, he shows up in their movies from the 30s and 40s and 50s. And then that horrible movie with Paul Newman in the 60s, early 70s. Yeah. Just if you're interested in Buffalo Bill, there aren't many good books to read. But just go on Amazon and try to find one. Or give me an email and I'll guide you. Okay, I'm going to stand up behind the lectern. We're having a little bit of difficulty for some of our auditorially challenged. And I'm standing on a stool because I'm height challenged. Before I forget it, let me mention that if you're so inclined, you can go on Amazon or PBS and you can find an American Experience segment for Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley. And that gives you a really nice 35, 40-minute presentation about the life and times of Buffalo Bill and the life and times of Annie Oakley. Annie Oakley. How many of you know what an Annie Oakley is? Does anybody know what an Annie Oakley is? Okay, well, I'm going to answer my own question. Professors often do that, since students are not necessarily always responsive. And Annie Oakley is like a ticket that has a hole in it. And free tickets to the Buffalo Bill show were given out liberally, and they were always had a hole punched in the middle of them to show the ticket takers that it was a freebie. So it's a freebie, Annie Oakley. Okay, Annie Oakley, Buffalo Bill's peerless lady wing shot. Over the years, I've always wanted to collect Annie Oakley ephemera, but it is so rare and so expensive that I only really have had a number of photographs called cabinet cards. Well, who is Annie Oakley? We all saw Ethel Merman and Betty Hutton in Annie, Get Your Gun. Please delete that from your memory. Then you saw back in the 40s the Barbara Stanwyck version of Annie Oakley. A little bit better, but not really. This is the Buffalo Bill Wild West poster that I think is the best one featuring Annie Oakley. And I would love to have it. Oh, I would love to have it. But it did sell recently for $25,000. I don't have it. This is what the posters in 1898 looked like. Annie Oakley was born in 1860 in Darke County, Cincinnati, which is very near the Indiana line, about 30, 40 miles north of Cincinnati. Her name was not Annie Oakley. Her name was Phoebe Ann Moses. That doesn't look good on a poster. She had a terrible terrible, tragic childhood. Her parents moved to Greenville, or outside of Greenville, when she was very young. I think she was 4 years old. And they were both Quakers, and they had an inn somewhere in Pennsylvania, I can't remember where, and it failed, and so what funds they could recover, they bought land in Darke County, Ohio, and started to farm. Unfortunately, their land was very soggy, and it was a tough struggle. And then when Annie was 6, she had 4 brothers and sisters. When Annie was 6, her father had taken their corn to the mill in the winter and ran into a blizzard, and he arrived back home with his hands completely frozen, and he died very shortly thereafter. So her mother was left with a mortgage farm and 5 kids, or 6, I can't remember, and tremendous poverty. And after about a year or so, as often the case in those days, children were farmed out. So if they couldn't find a relative who would take the child, they would have to be farmed out. And in Annie's case, she was sent to the county poor farm. Most of us in this room are old enough to remember what a county poor farm it was or is. And she was put in charge, or under the charge of the lady whose husband was the superintendent of the institution. And for about a year or so, things went well. The lady's name was Eddington, and she taught Annie a lot of skills, and sewing was one of them. Well, as poor farms were in those days, somebody came to the door one day and said, "We'd like to hire out a girl." And so the Eddingtons gave Annie to this family, and it was tragic. They thought they were getting a larger girl. Annie Oakley, by the way, never exceeded 5 foot. She was 5 foot. And for 2 years, she was abused, battered, and probably sexually molested. And she ran away after 2 years. She ran into town, got on a train with no money, and a kind gentleman gave her the fare to get home. And once she got home, her mother had remarried, but that stepfather was very ill. And so Annie basically didn't go to school very much, and she started to, she always liked being in the woods, and so by the time she's 12, 13 or so, she is trapping animals in the woods, she's shooting birds, and she is beginning to sell some of her birds, especially birds and rabbits, to a hotel in the nearest town, which is about 4 or 5 miles away, and to make a little money. Well, as years went by, she got better and better, and she shot more game, and she sold more game, and by the time she's 15 or 16, she was able to give her mother $200 to pay off the mortgage on their farm. And by this time, her mother had remarried for the third time, and this gentleman was going blind, but he was a very kind person, according to Annie. Her ability with a rifle, a pistol, and a shotgun were truly remarkable. Her eye-hand coordination must be perfect, absolute perfect, and her vision, unbelievable, because she was never taught to shoot. She taught herself and became a crack shot. And by time that she was 18, 19, we really don't know what in the world was happening in her life between about 16 and 20. But you just assume that, she was a game hunter because she was supporting her family. And when she was about 20, her sister, who lived in a suburb of Cincinnati, she was down visiting her sister, who was slowly dying of tuberculosis. And she saw that, I guess one of the proprietors, one of the hotels that was one of her customers, said, "I'd like to set you up in a shooting match to make some money." And he said, "I'll give you the entry money or the match money." And so anyway, the guy that she shot against was Frank Butler, her future husband. And Frank was a Irishman who came from Ireland to New York, and had married, had a child, and then became a vaudeville performer with a gentleman named Boffman. And they had an act that was full of dogs, trained dogs, and trick shooting. And, from one vaudeville theater to another, to fairgrounds. And he also shot matches to make money. And so anyway, long and short of it is that he was very surprised to find he was shooting against a girl. And that's what happened. And he beat him. He lost his money, but he was enchanted with Annie. He was 10 years older. And somehow or another, about a year later, they got married. Now, it's a little cloudy here, too, in terms of marriage certificates and so forth. She may have cohabited with him for a little while. But once she was married, 1881, they traveled on the circuit, cheap hotel to cheap hotel, riding on the night coach, and trying to make money. And in the off season, they would come back to Annie's family in Darke County and spend some of the off season with them. In 1884, they were doing a show somewhere in Minneapolis, near Minneapolis, or it was Minneapolis. And at the same time, Sitting Bull had been given permission to be exhibited. And he somehow found his way to watch Annie Oakley shoot on the stage. Because by that time, Frank had said, "Hey, Annie's a lot better than I am." So he became the manager, as well as her assistant. And she is the act now. And, well, anyway, Sitting Bull was just fascinated to see this 5'1" lady shooting cigarettes out of people's mouths. Yeah, she was that good. And so he made Frank Butler an offer. You know, I'll adopt the girl and take her home. So anyway, he was he came back and saw her act several times. And that's how she became Little Miss Sure Shot from from Sitting Bull. That's what she looked like in about 1890. She was a very attractive person, very petite, very attractive. And remember I told you, she became an excellent seamstress. And she always designed and sewed her own costumes. And they were pretty much the same for 30, 25 years. They were very ladylike. They basically tans and tan types of outfits and so on. And I don't know where this came from, but this little star on her hat, for her whole career, that star remained in her hat. And I've always wondered what the significance might be. There's Frank Butler, 10 years older, a very, very good shot, and a very knowledgeable guy, and who's madly in love with Annie until they both died about 2 weeks apart. He wrote poetry to her, and he wrote poetry all the time to her. Also, he was kind of full of the Irish blarney too, but he was devoted to her. And there's Sitting Bull. This is, and the next year, of course, in 1885, remember she met Sitting Bull in Minneapolis in 84. In 85, she's now with the Buffalo Bill Show, and guess what? She meets Sitting Bull again, this time in Montreal, Canada, where the show was playing. And Sitting Bull was with the Wild West. And the story of how she got to Buffalo Bill is interesting. Remember I mentioned that the Buffalo Bill show went to the bottom of the Mississippi River in 1884. And finally set up at New Orleans, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And Annie and Frank were there with the Sells Floto Circus doing trick shooting. And Annie saw the Wild West and said, we would be much better off with Buffalo Bill than the circus. Better pay, better conditions, you know. And so they went over and talked to Buffalo Bill, and he said, no, I can't use you right now because I've got shooters, or, you know, shootist. Cody was a crack shot. He shot glass balls in the arena every year of the show, from horseback, 73 Winchester, smoothbore, shooting shot, and he was dead shot, really. But anyway, and then there was Captain Bocardus, who was one of the best bird shots in the country, was also with the show. But anyway, Annie and Frank went back to the circus, and next year came for the 1885 season, and it was their seasons. Cody's season started from St. Louis, and Frank and Annie went down to St. Louis, and Annie walked right up to Cody and said, I want to audition again. And Cody said, okay. And he had something else to do, so she's out there in the arena, their practice arena, going through her act. And over in the stands was a guy standing there in a great big bowler hat, whiskers, and all at once he runs out and says, you're hired, you're hired. And that was Nate Salisbury, who was the co-owner and the manager of the Buffalo Bill Wild West. And that's how Annie wound up with Buffalo Bill Wild West from 1885 to 1902. And yes, she was here in Salem. And this is about what she looked like in about 1985. And the reason we know that is because most of her photographs after that, she has a whole chest full of medals. But she only has one medal here. And I frankly don't know what it is. And her life with the Wild West, for most of the years, she was the highest paid performer in the Wild West. She was treated very well, and she was a great crowd pleaser. And she also got along very well with the Indian contingent in the show, and they really respected her. But this costume here, I think, is one of her poorer efforts. As you can see, she has two medals. She has a model 1892 Winchester, and believe it or not, Red Shirt has a Sharps rifle. Annie survived the trip to London much better than anyone else in the crew, and this is at Earl's Court in London, 1877, for Queen Victoria's Jubilee. And Annie is standing back up there. Can you see him? See her? Yeah. And this is on the showgrounds with the artificial scenery in the back. Side note, Wild West played 300 performances in London in 1887 for over 6 months, and the worst attendance day was 20,000. That's a bad day. Wouldn't the Rolling Stones like it? But there was a cloud, and the cloud was Lillian Smith. For whatever reason, Cody hired another lady sharpshooter. And she was a 16-year-old who grew up in California. Her father taught her to shoot, and they traveled all over California giving shooting exhibitions and so on. Name was Lillian Smith, and here she is in London, 1887. Well, Annie Oakley is a lady. She's prim, she's proper, she's a lady. Her act is the same. And then all at once, she is thrown together in a competitive situation with Lillian Smith, a brash, vulgar, and thoroughly despicable character, according to most historians. She and Annie did not get along. And Annie acted kind of in a couple of ways that maybe she shouldn't have. But anyway, Lillian was 16, tremendous shot. Annie was, at that time, 26. And she decided to compete better with Lillian, with the newspapers and so forth. She shaved 6 years off her age. So Lillian was 16 and Annie was 20. Well, things didn't go well. Lillian, she used to hang around with the Cowboys, and stereotype about Cowboys, they do like to drink a little beer now and then. And she hung around with the Cowboys, and she just basically alienated Cody and Nate Salisbury. And but anyway, the relationship between Cody and Salisbury kind of got a little rough during the last part of the season. And the outcome was that Frank and Annie decided to leave the show after the last performance that year and go out on their own. And going out on their own, they gave shooting exhibitions, they shot matches, and they made good money. In fact, just to give you an example, they were invited to go to Germany. They went to Germany and gave exhibitions. One exhibition, the Prince, the future Kaiser, Prince Wilhelm, he was very impressed by Annie, and he insisted to participate in the act. And what he did, he said, "I will let you shoot the cigarette out of my mouth." And she did. And after World War I started, she often would tell the story. She said, "I generally never miss, but that time I wish I had have." So anyway, Frank and Annie were out on their own during most of the 1888 season, but by 1889, Frank and Annie are back with Buffalo Bill. Apparently Buffalo Bill's ego deflated. There wasn't, he wasn't feeling threatened by her, I guess. And they went with the show to spend the year in Paris. There was a big exhibition for the opening of the Eiffel Tower, and the Wild West played. The attendance was incredible. And then after that season was over, they wintered in Spain, and the Asian flu came by, or I guess it was called flu of some type, and killed a lot of the folks with the show. And so 1890, they came back. 1890, they were in Germany. 1891, Europe. 1993, they're at the Columbian Exhibition. This was Lillian Smith's husband, one of the cowboys she hung around with. Kid Willoughby was the name, otherwise known as Jim Kidd. And he got himself in a position with Cody, and Cody fired him because he was drunk all the time. There she is. Truly a magnificent shot. She could do anything. And she was dead shot with the mirror. She could ride a bicycle. Later, she part of her act was riding a bicycle and shooting. Now, two hands on the rifle, guiding the bicycle with her knees. And being a prim and proper lady, her skirt never came up because her gaiters, she wore gaiters that had buttons on them, and she put little strings around the buttons on the gaiters and attached them to her bloomers. So that when she was riding the bicycle, her skirt would never come up. And this is one of her shooting events. She had a 2-room tent on the Wild West grounds. The back room was a bedroom with dresser and so forth. And then there was a parlor room. And she had a rocker. She sewed constantly. She wrote letters. Frank had taught her to read and write. And very, very nice. And her tent was open for a lot of people. And somebody at halftime mentioned that about their father or grandfather shaking hands with Buffalo Bill. Yes, Buffalo Bill loved children, and it was any problem if you were this high getting into Buffalo Bill's tent. He loved children. You could shake his hand. And there she is. I doubt whether she made this dress, but it's pretty elegant. She was very concerned about money. she grew up so poor, and she and Frank struggled so hard. And that once they were starting to make $125 a week or so, they saved their money because, you know, there was no Social Security there back in those days, no pensions. And so they saved their money, and they would not stay in hotels on Sunday when the show didn't play. They would stay in the tent, save money. And she was notoriously tight. I think this was taken and colorized in 1893 during the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago. Again, the show played to 4 million people in Chicago, and she developed at that time a very close relationship with a Chicago reporter by the name of Amy Leslie. And they were friends for the rest of their lives. And Amy did write about Annie. And I really think that what she wrote was probably pretty true. And this is the cabinet card that you could have bought on the grounds in Chicago during the Columbian Exhibition. What is kind of unique about this cabinet card, if you look down to the bottom right, you see two little Stevens pistols crossed, and then she has a shotgun. And you could probably buy one of these cards for 10 cents or 20 cents or something like that. Today, you're looking at least $1,000 card. And before 2008, you could have had $500 to it. Annie liked children. She never had any children. Nobody really knows why. But she never had children, but she absolutely loved children. And the young kids, this is Bronco Bill Irving's little boy who grew up with the show. And she did a lot of mothering of young kids whose Indian families with the show. I think this is one of my favorite photographs of her. Kind of an interesting dress. Kind of Wild West. But I can tell you right now, this is not the dress or the costume that she wore during her act. This is showing you the table that she would put her firearms on, and Frank would hand them to her. But what she would do, you would see there would be something like a couple of guns, rifles usually, laying on the table, and she would come into the arena. This would be out in the middle of the arena, this table, and she would skip out or run. She could really run out to the table, and then she would vault over the table, twirl, and pick up the rifle, and then Frank would throw the ball up in the air, and boom. Pretty fantastic stuff. She was very athletic. Not only a great shot, but she was very athletic. And she could, riding around an arena, shooting glass balls on a bicycle. And she was an excellent horsewoman, too. She was a fantastic rider. But she never really rode in the Wild West show that much because she kind of left that to Bill Cody. And this is taken several years before her retirement. And what we see here are all of the medals, or some of the many, many medals. She was always considered in the shooting fraternity as one of the very best shots in the country. And in 1902, after they left Oregon, they went down all the way to Los Angeles, and then the train turned and went to North Carolina, and then it turned north, or the show turned north to end the year someplace in New Jersey. And there was a train wreck, and she was injured in a train wreck. not that seriously, but her hair turned white overnight. And anyway, she always said her hair turned white overnight because of the train wreck. Actually, Amy Leslie said what really had happened, she had gone to a health spa and been left in one of these contraptions that you got into, to bake. And they left her there for 40 minutes. And that was why her hair turned white. That was according to her friend Amy Leslie. But anyway, after the train wreck, she and Frank decided to hang it up. It's enough travel. And so they retired to a house they had built in Nutley, New Jersey. And it's a very nice bungalow-type house, and everything went well for a couple of years, except Frank often said she was a terrible housekeeper, and she was a person who just couldn't settle down, And so after a few years, they were on the road again, giving exhibitions and so on. And by that time, Frank is also a representative for the United Metallic Cartridge Company, which was owned by Remington Arms. And he was doing quite a bit of traveling representing Remington. And, but in 1905, a terrible thing happened. And probably, even though it was terrible, it really, to me, showed what kind of lady Annie Oakley really was. One of Randolph Hearst, one of the Hearst newspapers in Chicago, printed an article, a big article, saying, Annie Oakley, down and out, gets arrested for cocaine. I mean, it was awful. And, and so when Annie saw that, her whole life had been directed at becoming respectable, honest, respectable. And she was so sensitive about her reputation. And there she is. The Hearst newspapers, yellow journalism. And so she immediately, and there are lots of newspapers around the country picked it up, and she wrote letters immediately or telegrams to all the newspapers, and most of them retracted the article because there was a vaudeville performer who was indeed under cocaine, but when she was arrested, she said she was Annie Oakley. And so for the next 5 years, Annie Oakley didn't work very much at all. She sued newspapers, 55 suits. Most newspapers retracted, but she went to court 55 times, won 54 times. And she got $25,000 from the Hearst newspaper for libel. And anyway, she spent a good portion of her retirement doing that. And she estimated that the cost of the litigation equaled just about the cost, the awards that she got. But anyway, she was satisfied that her reputation was restored. Her last years, she and Frank spent their last years, for a couple of winters, they went down to Florida to do shooting matches and so on. But they became very, very happy to stay during the winter season in Pinehurst, North Carolina. Pinehurst is southwest of Raleigh. It's on the backside of the Fort Bragg military reservation. And that's where the rich people went to spend some of the winter. And she taught women how to shoot. And that's something she'd always interested in, and she spent a lot of time doing it. She probably taught 10,000 women to shoot. She was a reformer, but she was not, she never really advocated women's suffrage, but she demanded equal pay for equal work, and she demanded, especially about women entering the professions that they were blocked out of, including shooting. And she was an avid hunter. She and Frank hunted and hunted. They had their dogs were always spaniels, and that's about what she did until she became very ill after a car wreck in 1922, and this time she had to walk with a brace, and she was anemic, and she and Frank died a couple of weeks with each other in 1926, and they're both buried in Darke County, Greenville, Ohio, and there is an Annie Oakley Museum there that you can go to and see. And all in all, I think she was an incredibly interesting woman. She worked for everything she ever got, and she was goal-directed, and even though she had her quirks, as we all do, she was one heck of a good performer, heck of a good person. And we don't know a lot about her. Cody got more press, books and so on. But what we knew about Annie Oakley, she was an American icon too. And it is now 20 minutes after 12. Do you have any questions? All right.
Hi, this is Deborah. Just because of her nasty reputation, I'm wondering about what happened to Lillian Smith, the young upstart, and what happened with her.
I'm sorry?
I'm interested in knowing what happened to Lillian Smith, the 16-year-old.
Oh, I can tell you that.
Yeah.
Lillian Smith came back and roamed around the country giving shooting exhibitions and matches. And then she was an alcoholic who could still shoot fairly well. And she joined up with the 101 Ranch out of Oklahoma. And she died there from alcoholism in her mid-40s. And a lot of her rifles are in a museum in Tulsa.
I have a question. Was she able to shoot coins in the air? I've read something about
Not only could she shoot coins in the air, but she could also split a playing card on edge.
Oh my God.
I mean, it wasn't anything for her to take a playing card and, if the playing card had a spade, in the middle of it, shoot. She had phenomenal vision.
Joel over here. Just question of clarification. They died within a week of each other. What did Frank die of, and who died first?
Eddie died first. Frank was up in Michigan. He was 10 years older, in frail health. His death certificate says, dementia. I don't know. I've read 2 or 3 interpretations, and I'm not sure which is true. But he was feeble, and he was 76 years old. And 76 years old in 1926 was old. Yeah.
Grant here. As an old musician, I'm interested in this. During your reading, this sounds like a kind of a circus atmosphere. Did they have like a circus band that traveled along with them?
I'm sorry?
Did they have like a circus band that traveled along with the show?
Circus band. The very first show, May the 19th, 1883, William Sweeney and the Cowboy Band went with every Buffalo Bill Wild West performance until the very end. Bill Sweeney was a musician from Cody's hometown, North Platte, Nebraska, and so that's yes. Now, after Buffalo Bill joined with Pawnee Bill, Pawnee Bill had some circus equipment, like a calliope, and they did have that.
And you know that Annie Get Your Gun was written about her, right? A very fine musical, Annie Get Your Gun, with the song You Can't Get a Man with a Gun.
She did.
But she did.
And she made him pay for it, too.
Oh, Paul here. PBS had, I think it might have been the American Experience or one of those things where they had a thing on the history of the circus in the United States, Barnum and so forth like that. But that probably gives you a parallel universe there in terms of how much promotion and how big the circuses and the Wild West show were, and they traveled around like crazy. It's kind of a massive effort and quite an interesting history.
The Buffalo Bill Wild West was not a show, nor was it a circus. It was an exhibition, here again, showing Western cowboys doing the things they did on the range, branding, roping, riding, busting broncos, and same thing with the Indian village, the Indian way of life, and then, of course, reenacting historical events. Cody always called it an exhibition, never a show, never a circus. It's only those last 2 years where Cody was forced to travel with the Salisbury Circus did it really have a circus aura. The trains, they usually had 2 trains for a total of 160 cars to transport the arena. They had the largest and first electrical plant in the United States, designed by Edison. They fed 500 to 600 people 3 times a day. They had 2 or 3 railroad cars 2 weeks ahead of them, the advance team. It was a huge enterprise. And in fact, the German military studied it in depth in terms of how they were able to take it down. Like, for instance, here, they got here at 4:30 in the morning. They had played a performance the previous evening in Portland. In fact, and they played an afternoon performance in Portland. They both drew over 14,000 in Portland, and they had to turn people away. So they could pick it up and move it. Usually in the early days, like they would spend most of a whole season in one place, like New York, Chicago, and then Staten Island, there was a performance arena for them. But after 1891, they were playing like 130 cities a year, 120.
Tom, this is Jim.
Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for presenting this, because I learned a lot from what you had to say. Cody, Wyoming, did Buffalo Bill live there for very long, and did he name the town, or how'd that work?
One story I haven't told you is about all of his failed enterprises. He was a visionary, but he was a visionary, but he had to let other people enact his visions. And the federal government passed, I forget, it was during the Roosevelt administration, 1 million acres, every state could get 1 million acres of federal land if they would develop it for irrigation. And Cody looked at the Bighorn Basin and said, this is a great idea. And so he put together a group of investors to create an irrigation system in the Bighorn Basin, which is right now where Cody is. And to get this irrigation operation going, they had to have a town. And that's how Cody, the town of Cody, got started about it was 1890, early, about 1900 or so. And that's how Cody came about. And he had a ranch there. He built a hotel that still stands. If you ever go to Cody, eat lunch there, the Irma Hotel, great buffalo burgers. And the museum is world class. And so anyway, that's how Cody came about. The town of Cody came about because of the irrigation project that Cody dumped hundreds of thousands of dollars in and never got completed.
Well, thank you, Tom. We're going to hear more stories from him, I'm sure. Welcome to ICL.
Thank you.